This is Phil Levy with the University of Virginia Darden School of Business, and we're at the University of Virginia Investing Conference 2012. It's a great pleasure to be here with Larry Goodman, the president of the Center for Financial Stability. Welcome. It's great to see you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here with you today, Phil.
Well, this is a very exciting and sometimes terrifying time to be thinking about the global economic situation. We've just come off an election. We're facing a lot of big issues in the world economy. Maybe you could start by giving us an overview of how you see the global economic situation in the months to come.
Well, I think that the economic situation is unfortunately characterized by an overused word, and the overused word is uncertainty. Despite the fact that we've had an election and we now have more certainty, there still is a tremendous amount of uncertainty left in the global economy. Now, this uncertainty comes deeply from distortions in fiscal and monetary policy, and these distortions are likely to hang heavy over financial markets into the near term. So depending upon how we address, how policymakers and officials address some of these distortions, whether it's a supersized budget deficit with a large debt on top of that, or how we address this creation of total reserves or money at the Fed will be of paramount importance for how investment opportunities shape up over the next 3 to 12 months.
Well, let's turn to that creation of money and what the Fed does. I know this is mystifying to a number of people because we're in sort of uncharted terrain. It used to be that you could measure monetary policy by just looking at the Fed funds rate, watch the interest rate, see where it goes. That's been stuck pretty near zero for a while, and it's gotten much harder to know what the Fed is doing. You put out some data that's supposed to give a guide to this. Can you describe what that data is and what it's telling us?
Absolutely, and in fact, as you're mentioning, the federal funds rate has been flat as a pancake for many, many, many months, and the Fed is suggesting that it's going to remain that way. Despite that, the Fed's balance sheet has swollen by 110% on average per annum. So there's a lot going on beneath the surface surrounding monetary policy. One of the things that we've done at the Center for Financial Stability under Professor William A. Barnett's leadership is we've developed our own monetary aggregates. And our own monetary aggregates stretch from the banking system to the shadow banking system. In other words, we're measuring liabilities throughout the financial system in the United States. It's the most comprehensive measures of money within the United States. We have an M4 number that evaluates a big swath of what's happening in the monetary economy. The data have been helpful because it gives us a sense for measuring and monitoring the Fed in real time. And it also, more importantly, provides us with an ability to measure what's happening in the private sector. When you look at total reserves at the Fed, that's only about 8% of the total money in the U.S. economy. So a lot's happening outside of the Fed. The Fed is pushing hard to create more money, to build up the reserves. However, it's not going anywhere. The monetary wheels are clogged. The monetary transmission mechanism is encountering some serious problems based upon our data. And that will be integral in terms of how to think through future investment opportunities or how to just evaluate the overall performance of various facets of the banking system in the United States.
And that story looks different if you look at these broader aggregates than if you were to look at sort of conventional narrow aggregates like M1 or M2. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. In fact, when you look at the most narrow of measures of money, total reserves at the Fed, the swell has been a persistent and consistent one. On the outer end of the spectrum, which we've created an M4, and it's what we call a Divisia M4, and this is where Bill's brilliance comes in, is that different forms of money are different. For instance, cash has a very different property than commercial paper or a money market fund or even a repo transaction. So depending upon how you weight the aggregates, you can get differing perspectives, and an aggregate that actually has a more stable property of velocity than many of the aggregates that are simply summed up together. So on the outer end of that money spectrum, which we call an M4 or a DM4 for Divisia money, the growth has been on average about 1% per annum. And it's interesting because it's telling us two things. The first thing is that it's telling us is that the monetary wheels are clogged. The second thing that it's telling us is that the overall economy is not performing well. Typically, when the economy is performing at trend, say 3.25%, you will see a year-on-year creation of about 6% year-on-year in this aggregate. So we're well below where we need to be. The good news is that it looks like the U.S. economy has bottomed based upon this aggregate, and we're starting to see some forward momentum, but we're still a ways below where we need to be in terms of generating sustainable economic growth.
So what do you conclude then about Fed policy? Is Chairman Bernanke doing everything he can, but it's just not enough? 1% doesn't sound terribly impressive. Or is it that that there's more that they ought to be doing?
Well, that's a great question. Our sense is that the Fed has been in a very difficult position, right? The Fed inherited a strong financial crisis. The Fed acted aggressively. The Fed has been targeting unemployment, trying to bring that unemployment rate down. The response has been unusual. The Fed even labels it non-traditional monetary operations. The issue, though, is whether or not the efficacy of monetary policy is what one would have expected. Our data show that despite this proliferation in total reserves, the sympathetic pass-through is just not there. So something's broken. Our expectation is that two things are operative. The first is that you're seeing a natural diminishing in the size of the financial system. The second, perhaps of greater consequence, is that the regulatory overload and the regulatory uncertainty, going back to the first topic that we were discussing about uncertainty, yeah. Regulatory uncertainty is unequivocally hanging heavy over the financial services industry. And you see that vividly in our data. You see the money market funds not performing well. You see commercial paper not performing well. And a big part of that is related to questions surrounding the future regulatory outlook.
Now, of course, in the wake of the financial crisis that we suffered, fixing the financial sector, sort of restoring stability, was a major point of emphasis. And we saw the DoddFrank law that was supposed to address this. To what extent is it doing its job, or is this part of that source of uncertainty? How do you assess the situation looking at this, which is supposed to be the transmission mechanism whereby we go from the Fed's work out to actual lending to businesses and individuals?
Dodd-Frank in many ways represents a step forward. The financial sector of the U.S. economy has gotten more priority than it ever has. Sadly, prioritizing the financial system has been lacking, and that's one of the reasons why I, along with my colleagues, started the Center for Financial Stability, and that is that the financial system in the United States has not as closely been evaluated from a public policy perspective. So Dodd-Frank is a positive in that it takes that first step. However, Dodd-Frank is over 2,300 pages long. Many in financial markets who care about financial markets rather than just pushing for financial change to benefit their own business, which there is the fear of that, believe that the regulations are confusing. There needs to be a simplification of Dodd-Frank, or maybe not even Dodd-Frank, a simplification of regulation so that investors have the right incentives to act. act for their own profitability, but also act in a way that the financial system will be as best safeguarded as possible. There's no regulation, there's no regulatory framework then that can eliminate crises. However, if there are structures that incent investors and regulators, that's really where we need to go with Dodd-Frank. At this stage, there still needs to be a lot of work in simplifying Dodd-Frank so that that pass-through mechanism from the money creation at the Fed through the financial system and ultimately to economic growth starts to fire correctly.
Let me just close by asking you, you've described sort of the need to simplify Dodd-Frank. Is that the key to addressing financial system woes? Is it all contained in there if only we do it right? Or are there other measures that one needs to address? Not to eliminate the possibility of crises, but maybe to mitigate.
Well, I think that the regulatory issue is an important one. I also think that the fiscal situation is critical as well. There's a tremendous amount of uncertainty surrounding the fiscal overburden, whether or not it's evaluating a string of supersized deficits, coupled with one thing that's not as actively discussed as it should be, relates to the maturities of principal falling due in the United States. So the total cash call on financial markets from the Treasury is the deficit plus these principal payments. And sadly, because of this low rate environment, Treasury has been funding itself on the short end of the curve. Why pay 2+% out the curve when you can pay interest at 0? You save on the deficit. But what you end up having is a 16% of GDP falling due over the next year in principal payments. The average is 10%. So Treasury is now more dependent upon financial markets, not only from the fiscal perspective, but also from a payment basis as well. And that too is a very large uncertainty hanging over the economy.
Well, that's a sobering outlook on where we're going, but an insightful one, and thank you very much for it.
Thank you very much, Phil.